Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti. Welcome to Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò of New York University. We have great pleasure to continue our Manzoneide, the marathon of events dedicated to the new translation of the Betrothed. Michael, come l'ho pronunciato? Getting there. I have been trying to say this word for I don't know how long, and I still cannot pronounce it, so bear with me. So for the new translation of the Betrothed by Michael Moore, and we had a series of events, and there are more upcoming to celebrate this fundamental event that brings to the American public a translation in contemporary English of the founding novel of modernity in Italy. So this evening we tackle a very specific aspect of the novel, and that is what is the relationship of literature with the religion, vaguely speaking, and more specifically, of course, in the case of Manzoni, is this the quintessential Catholic novel? What does it mean to be a Catholic novel? And we decided to go at the very root and ask to the boss, who knows what is being Catholic. That would be the Pope. And the Pope, as you will hear from Padre Spadaro, is an avid reader of literature, of novels, of poetry, of fiction. And he gives advice also to people of things that they should read or quotes the novels. So what's in the papal reading list, aside from Manzoni, that we know occupies a central role? So these are some of the questions that we asked Father Spadaro to answer in his lecture. And then after that we invited two guests that are very special to us, Elie and Antonio Monda. We'll introduce them before they come to the stage for the discussion. So the order of the works is, we're going to see now a mini doc, it's only 3-4 minutes, about the photographic exhibit that is upstairs. If you pass by and didn't have a chance to look at it, when you go up, please do. And now with the documentary, you will get a bit more of understanding of what the exhibit is about. And then I'll come back to introduce Michael. Let's roll the movie.
La mostra The Mutation è composta da 45 fotografie di Mike Slack ispirate ai Promessi Sposi e alla vita di Alessandro Manzoni o ai suoi interessi.
These are pictures I made over the course of 2021 in northern Italy. The photographs were in no way ever intended to illustrate the narrative or to even necessarily tell a story. The idea was to set up a couple of parameters, the main one being the fact that Milan at the beginning of the project was still locked down and travel was very restricted. The other one was obviously to use the novel to shape an itinerary, to follow the path of some of the characters, to visit the locations of the novel. And along the way there were a lot of diversions and detours and improvisations.
Signore e signori, buonasera. Welcome back to Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. This evening we celebrate a huge accomplishment of Michael Moore. He's helping bring the quintessential Italian novel to the American public in their language. How you decided to translate I Promessi Sposi?
There's sort of a vocation to explain Italy to Americans, really,
I knew about the novel because I had a long career in the book publishing business in the US, and I knew there was a Penguin paperback, but of course I'd never read it and I didn't know anything about it.
So I discovered like a clip or some article that you were doing a new translation, and I say, wow, that's...
The guy had put me in touch with Michael, and he started sharing sections of his manuscript in progress, and I had a nice conversation with him about using this in some way to make some visual art.
The second time I met Mike, I had him come over to my house, and he wanted to look at my various drafts, and at that point I was well into it, but I had my original first draft, which I wrote in longhand with a fountain pen. So we spread all of this out on my bed, which was the largest flat surface that I had beside the floor, and he took pictures. Mike took a free hand. He used excerpts from the translation I did. And so I think that his photographs depart from the novel and they return to the novel. So I think that there's this kind of specular relationship between the two. My translation is the first in 50 years, and my goal was first of all to show that it is a novel that could be appreciated in English by, first of all, bringing out the beauty of the language, and also by looking at the various gradations of the language, the various registers. Manzoni is constantly shifting between a very lyrical mode, a comic mode, a solemn mode. So I tried to capture these variations and their dynamism.
As I read the novel, what occurred to me is that there's several levels of translation in this entire project. I was reading Michael Moore's translation as he was still editing it. The novel itself is framed as a translation. And I was making this work during a time when there were several new strains of the COVID-19 because the virus was mutating. And this idea of translation, transition, change, and mutation sort of crystallized and became the main idea for how I was editing the pictures and even what I was looking for as I was shooting.
Manzoni had to translate his native language, which would have been Lombardo, the local dialect, into Florentine Italian. I translated into what I consider standard American English, and Mike Slack has now translated it into this beautiful photography exhibit.
Thank you. So when you go upstairs, take a look at the exhibit. And now I would like to invite to address you with a few ideas about how this panel came about, right, Michael? The translator around which this whole Manzoneide Moreide revolved. Michael Moore received his PhD in Italian literature from this department, this very department here at New York University. We are very proud of him, of course. And for many years he worked as an interpreter and translator. He was the chief interpreter and translator for the Italian mission to the United Nations. And in that capacity, he was able to make Italian politicians sound way more intelligent than they are. I'm totally serious, I'm not kidding. And Michael on the side cultivated his real passion, that is literary translation, not only with the books that he translated, but also actively in a militant way to support translations, to introduce new generations to translation, very active with the Pen Festival and many other initiatives. And we are delighted that he embraced this huge project of the Betrothed and l'ha portato in porto. At some point, I think he even himself despaired about reaching the end of it. So we are delighted that he did that. That's why we celebrate his accomplishment. And I would like to ask you to welcome very warmly Michael Moore.
Thank you, Stefano, for your kind words, but not only for that, but for all that you have done for Italian culture and its aficionados before, during, and after the pandemic. In particular, I cannot begin to express my gratitude for the enthusiasm with which you have embraced my translation of I Promessi Sposi. This time I'm saying it in Italian. And the multidisciplinary series of events you have dedicated to it, including most prominently tonight's lecture and discussion. When I first set out to translate I Promessi Sposi, so many years ago, I was already familiar with the varied reasons that Italians have given for the novel's obscurity outside of Italy. Some say that it is too Catholic, whatever that means. Being from a large Irish Catholic family myself, and having gone to a parochial school, the world I knew growing up was Catholic, as were the children I played with, the Gormans, all from large clans of their own. To the non-sectarian University of Chicago, and heard my family and our like criticized for supposedly overpopulating the planet, a big concern in the 1970s. Classmates, I guess, too Catholic was shorthand for too many children. I heard another explanation from a famous Italian poet. He told me that Americans could not appreciate I Promessi Sposi because we don't understand the concept of divine providence. I was puzzled, since I grew up right outside of a city called, yes, Providence. And this country is filled with towns and villages with biblical names and no lack of churches. There must have been 10 churches of various Christian denominations on my street in my small town. Quite simply put, I began my translation in the belief that the previous translations were inadequate, failing to capture the energy, the irony, and the beautiful sweep of Manzoni's prose. Even in Italian, the novel is freighted with stale interpretations, suffocated by a hermeneutic that privileges its edifying messages at the expense of its aesthetic and literary merits. I would compare my job, then, to that of a restorer, like the artist who swabbed away centuries of soot and ash from the vault of the Sistine Chapel to reveal the brilliant colors of Michelangelo's fresco. Now that I'm done, and my manuscript is a book making its way in the world, I have to admit to being very proud of what I've done. I know that pride is a sin, Father, but as Osgood says in the last line of the movie Some Like It Hot, nobody's perfect. Which brings me to tonight's event. When Stefano and his team were brainstorming about the Manzoniade, I suggested that we take up, or rather take on, the theme of the Catholic novel. Despite, or perhaps because of my religious background, it is the aspect of the Betrothed that troubled me the most. Partly because of the very ornate discourse of Cardinal Borromeo, offered, in my view at least, without Manzoni's customary skepticism toward high rhetoric, and partly because, in my wish to look past the traditionalist emphasis on divine providence in the novel, it was hard to find the right focus for the novel's more religious passages. This is not to say that I translated them carelessly or badly, only to admit that in the more abstract reaches of theology, I sometimes felt a little bit out of my depth. The first person to come to mind as someone better equipped than me to address the religious dimensions of the novel is Paul Elie. I first met Paul many years ago when I was doing actually my first translation, and he was an editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. A few years later, it was a very emotional experience for me when I read his The Life You Save May Be Your Own, An American Pilgrimage. Not only was the book eloquent and insightful, it also took me back to the world of my parents and to the books on the shelves of our family library, such as The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton, and especially The Long Loneliness by Dorothy Day. Day was an inspirational figure who reinforced my parents' vocation for activism and social justice. Paul then suggested that we invite Antonio Monda to be on the panel. I have known and admired Antonio for years through his passionate activity in the field of cinema, and I'm delighted to discover that he is equally respected for his work on the intersection of art and religion. Finally, it was Stefano who came up with the idea of inviting Father Antonio Spadaro to complete our panel with the dimension of the Pope Francis's reading list and place the novel I have so lovingly translated into a fascinating new context. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I am eager to hear what you have to say, to learn, and hopefully to be provoked. As I realized in speaking with Paul yesterday, a new translation of a classic gives it a new life and provides us with an opportunity for fresh, new readings. What could be more welcome? I'd hoped to have the book on sale today, but it has done so well that it's now gone into a second printing and is slowly making its way down from Canada. With that, I welcome you.
Grazie mille, Michael. I would like also to thank His Excellency Archbishop Gabriele Caccia, who is the Papal Nuntius to the United Nations, for his presence here tonight. And now it's the time to introduce Father Antonio Spadaro. As you heard, Michael said it was my idea. I'm very proud of this idea. I've known and been friend, and I'm honored of the friendship of Padre Spadaro for a long time, when he was a scrittore for Civiltà Cattolica. His initial interests are in literature, and I believe your first book was on Pier Vittorio Tondelli. And his last book is on 4 American painters, all of whom from New York. So this gives you an idea of the span of the interest of Father Spadaro, not to mention the fact that being the editor-in-chief of Civiltà Cattolica, that, as you might know, is the oldest Italian journal still in publication. We have the second, the uprunner, that is Nuova Antologia. In our library we have the entire collection, and they represented the 2 souls of Italy, one more secular one, and one, of course, the Catholic side. And As I told you, these are only some of his interests. He's also interested in anything that has to do with technology and information technology and how it influences and it changes our way of understanding things. I would say he's responsible for bringing internet inside the sacred palaces of the Vatican. And now it's a big presence, and he's responsible for it. And really, what I would like to say is that even if now he writes about international politics, and very acutely, obviously, and in a very original way, you hear the literary formation and the literary background of Father Spadaro. And I think that's the reason why he was the most suited person to talk about the Pope's reading list. He has nothing to do with the title we decided to give to tonight's evening, because we are not going to talk about Dostoevsky, or very little, un pochino. We're definitely talking about Manzoni, and we have already started, but Borges is not going to be mentioned. But he is the person that can tell us what's in this list, why is Manzoni so prominent, and who are the other authors that we find, and why. So we start with his lecture, and then we move on to the discussion with Paul and Antonio. But please welcome Father Antonio Spadaro.
Thanks a lot for being here, all of you. Thanks to people who is following this event online. Thanks to Monsignor Caccia for being here. Thanks to Stefano, who inspired me to go deeper in the relationship between Bergoglio, Pope Francis, and literature. Preparing this lecture, I ended up writing a book, but don't worry, I'll stay in the time given to me. But I am very grateful to Stefano because I followed the quotations that Pope Francis made in his speeches, interviews, books, and so on. And so, but I didn't have time for collecting them and for going deeper. And so this was the perfect occasion for going deeper. You see, the novel literature reads the human heart, helps to accommodate desire, splendor, and misery. It's not theory. It helps to preach, to know the heart. That's what Pope Francis told me when I interviewed him in 2016, my second interview to him, at the end of our meeting. So novel literature reads the human heart, helps to accommodate desire, splendor, and misery. Pope Francis has always been a reader of literature. Novels and poetry have accompanied him in his formation. In a 2009 interview, he said that from a young age, literature me gustava mucho. I used to like it very much. In fact, his memories as a reader go back to childhood, when his father read books aloud after dinner. There was no television yet. Today, exactly 10 years after his election as pontiff, I would like to reconstruct the path of his readings. And so also the literary references he scatters in his texts and interviews. I will try to give some indication to build a map, a path among the texts that have shaped his way of thinking. Bergoglio, as a young Jesuit, was involved in teaching literature at the high school of the Colegio de la Inmaculada Concepción in Santa Fe, an old Jesuit school, Argentinian school. There he developed the conviction that creative experience is very relevant. He was 20 years old. As a teacher, he understood that the best way for his students to love and understand literature was for them to express themselves creatively. So he gave creative writing classes and asked his students to write short stories. Eventually, he decided to have Borges read 2 short stories written by his students. He knew, in fact, his secretary, who had been his piano teacher. Borges liked them very much, So Bergoglio, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the young professor, asked him to write the introduction to a collection of these stories, and he did. This experience of the past has an echo in today. It struck me that he wanted to write the preface to the poems of a young poet, Luca Milanese, who is completely unknown, but who in 2020 published a collection of poetry entitled Rime a sorpresa, surprise written rhymes. It would not be a surprise, I think, to read a papal preface on the work of a poet who has entered the culture and sensibility of entire generations, especially one as distant by centuries as Dante, for example. And Bergoglio himself has in fact published on an apostolic letter on the occasion of the 7th centenary of the death of the supreme poet, the Sommo Poeta, entitled Candor Lucis Aeterne. But it has never happened that a pontiff wrote a page introducing the work of a young poet. In his preface, Pope Francis notes that Milanese's poetry arises as a spontaneous ability to, he wrote, see connections even there where there seems to be none. He knows how to grasp in seemingly random things a new, different depth. So poetry makes one see connections and correspondences. I know from his students that Bergoglio, as a young professor, loved to teach Baudelaire, whom he, as a pontiff, also quoted in one of his speeches. Perhaps there is an echo of the symbolic density of the correspondence in the words written for Milanese. Also significant is the fact that he wanted to write on June the 20th, 1981, so when he was a Jesuit father, the preface to a collection of poems by the Argentinian Jesuit Osvaldo Pol entitled De Destierros y Moradas, of Exile and Dwellings. He writes, the poetic word has dwellings of flesh in the human heart, and, at the same time, feels the weight of wings that have not yet taken flight. I really love this quotation. This is an important definition of poetry here. It absorbs the feelings, the passion, the carnality of desire. That is why its weight is not that of wings that, once they have taken flight, are no longer felt. On the contrary, the poem feels this weight because the wings still touch the earth, and so it expresses it. Why this poetic passion that is also expressed by accompanying the text of poets not canonized by critics, if not even young students? Certainly, one reason is that Bergoglio knows that lack of imagination is a serious problem for faith. We lack powerful images that help us imagine the truths we believe. This is, for example, one of the reasons why he loves popular piety. It's a golden reserve of strong images that are well grafted into the collective imagination of a people. So here I will continue by talking about novelists such as Dostoevsky and Manzoni. If I have time, I will also talk about a poet who is very relevant to Bergoglio, I mean Virgil, author of the Aeneid. There is a peculiar aspect of literary expression that Bergoglio loves. I love tragic artists, Francis told me during my first interview in 2013. On a couple of occasions, I also had the opportunity to be able to talk with Pope Francis about the topic. One example is Dostoevsky. I knew that the great Russian novelist was among Bergoglio's most beloved. He said that several times, including the press conference on the flight back from Bahrain a few weeks ago. But which work in particular? The Brothers Karamazov? It was the one I had imagined. In fact, it must be remembered that as Archbishop, on the occasion of the canonization of the Argentinian martyrs on May 27, 1988, he quoted precisely the Brothers Karamazov. Whoever does not believe in God will not believe in God's people either. But when I asked directly, what do you like about Dostoevsky, Pope Francis replied, Memoir of the Underground. I don't know how you translate this work in English, I think. Yeah, Notes on the Underground. Notes from the Underground. So later in my 2016 interview, he described it as a jewel. I want to dwell here on one aspect of this passion for tragedy, the fact that it testifies to the complexity and contradictory nature of human experience, of life. Bergoglio loves tensions, polar oppositions, as Romano Guardini was a great interpreter of Dostoevsky, calls them, and who had a great impact on Bergoglian thought. Dostoevsky writes in Notes from the Underground that it is not necessarily 2 + 2 = 4, but could also be 2 + 2 = 5. In fact, 2 + 2 = 4 is no longer life, but the principle of death. The novels reads. So it's a quotation. Calculating, conceptual and abstract thinking fail to grasp life and its concrete contradictions. After all, one of the cornerstones of Bergoglio's thinking is that reality always comes before the idea, and the complexity of the polyhedron is superior to the equidistances of the sphere. Did he learn it from Dostoevsky? Certainly from Guardini, he learned that Dostoevsky describes the existence of his characters by considering 2 poles in tension: the moment of fullness of existence and the undefined, the fluid element elusive to all form, the sudden and the unpredictable. This is a quotation from Guardini. This seems to me a crucial point for understanding Francis and even what the Catholic novel is for him, because this infraction of the rigid logic postulated by the great Russian writer can also be seen as the basis of what he had called, in my 2013 interview, incomplete thinking or open thinking, which has nothing rigid about it. The need for incomplete thinking can be traced in his passion also for the dystopian novel The Lord of the World, written by Robert Hugh Benson. In this work, a charismatic world leader emerges and seduces many into thinking that he represents the way beyond the divisions constituted, for example, by nations and religions, into a broader and more inclusive humanism. Appearing then are the fruits of the lie of an abstractly humanitarian ideal of so-called single thinking, le pensée unique, or as he called it on his trip to Bahrain, isolated thinking. On April the 4th, 2005, Monsignor Bergoglio wrote a text on the imperialist conception of globalization. To describe it, he said that it is conceived as a perfect, clean sphere. All peoples merge into a uniformity that nullifies the tension between diversities, which are very relevant for him. This globalization constitutes the most dangerous totalitarism of postmodernity, he said. Incomplete thinking, whereby two and two do not always make four, is precisely the opposite of globalized and isolated single thinking. Bergoglio likes the popular literature. By popular, Bergoglio means that it has a connection with people that leads him in his apostolic journeys to refer to writers and poets from the place he visits, such as Miklos Radnoti in Hungary, or Abba in Kazakhstan, Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Colombia, Gabriela Mistral in Chile, Octavio Paz in Mexico. This link between people and art is evident in Bergoglio's love for a work that, by his own admission, is not a masterpiece. The Argentine epic poem Martín Fierro, written by José Hernández in 1872. This work gives shape to the desire for a society in which everyone finds a place. So again, the diversity, the tensions, as I described to you before talking about Dostoevsky. I will get back there again. So the society described in Martín Fierro is made by the Porteño trader, the coastal gaucho, the northern shepherd, the northeastern artisan, the aborigine, and the immigrant, to the extent that no one of them desires to have everything for himself, expelling the other from the land. His way of talking about Martín Fierro is reminiscent of the democratic and popular romanticism of Walt Whitman, a contemporary of Hernandez, who feels the Dakota carpenter, the Californian miner, the mechanic, and the bricklayer, the boatman, and the shoemaker. But it is necessary to mention also the Bergoglio's great interest in Leopoldo Marechal, a classic of Argentine literature, because he well expresses the value of the unity of a people on the basis of diversity and mestizaje. The link between the writer is in particular the fascination of Buenos Aires as an international city. It is caught in a truly Dantesque but also Dostoevskian descent into a metropolitan underground. Marechal helped Bergoglio reflect on and imagine the value of mestizo. It's the description of the idealized city of Philadelphia that is striking in Adán Buenos Aires, the masterpiece of Leopoldo Marechal. Mixture and differences composed in harmony build citizenship. Philadelphia, writes Marechal, is the city of brothers among the metropolis of the world. The city is home to all who live it in their differences. How can we not see here the background of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti? It's illuminating about the relationship between literature and people, how important the work of the French writer Joseph Maleg is for Bergoglio. He told me in 2013 interview, "I see holiness in the people of God, their daily holiness. There is a middle class of holiness that we can all be part of, the one Maleg talks about." I didn't know anything about Maleg before Bergoglio mentioned me in this interview. Born in 1876 and died in 1940, the writer is known for his unfinished trilogy Pierre Noire, Le classe moyenne du salut, Black Stones, the middle class of salvation. Describing what he means by the middle class of holiness, Francis said, "I see holiness in the passionate people of God, a woman who raises children, a man who works to bring home bread, the sick, elderly priests who have so many wounds but have smiles because they have served the Lord, nuns who work so hard and live a hidden holiness. This, for me, is the common holiness. Francis manifested the link with Maleg's work even at the beginning of his Gaudete and Exultate, an apostolic exhortation written by him, an exhortation on the call to holiness in the contemporary world. But we are not far from his reasons for reading another great novel, Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed. He read it 4 times. He told me about it in the 2013 interview with a very personal recollection. I read the book, The Betrothed, 3 times, and I have it now on the table to read it again. Manzoni has given me so much. My grandmother, when I was a child, taught me by heart the beginning of this book, the branch of Lake Como that turns south between 2 unbroken mountains chains. In a later interview, he recalled his first connection with this novel. Grandma used to read us a few chapters of The Betrothed and even helped us study them by heart. Recently, I picked them up again because every time you open them, you find something new in them. Often my father would recite passages of The Betrothed to us by heart and explain them to us. It appears evident how Bergoglio's reading of Manzoni's novel is the result of readings done in the family, of personal memories that have the warmth of affection, of the presence of his grandmother and his father. Manzoni's work in the novel of mechanical and lowly people who become instruments of divine providence. Stories and history are intertwined, going through tribulation. Human machination are manifested, and God's consolation are experienced. Lucia, who rightfully belongs to the figures of the middle class of holiness, is persecuted by human meanness. It's precisely she who carries the proclamation of God's mercy. This is the profound meaning of the upper, the innominato, the unnamed, to whom the announcement of God's mercy is made. What can I, a lowly person, demand but that you use mercy on me? God forgives many things for a work of mercy. These are words said by Lucia in The Betrothed. Bergoglio is clearly impressed by works that put forth mercy, a literature of mercy. I want to recall here that on his trip to the Holy Land, Francis referred to terrorists with the literally powerful expression of poor criminal people. This definition echoes Christ's choice before the Grand Inquisitor, as Dostoevsky presented to us in The Brothers Karamazov. A kiss on the lips of the one who announces to him the death sentence. A kiss that does not change his mind, but that makes his lip tremble and burns the heart. For Bergoglio, the choice of Christ before the Grand Inquisitor is close to that of Lucia before the unnamed, which he has well in mind, so much so that he quoted him, for example, at the key moment at the beginning of his pontificate in Lampedusa on July 8, 2013, with these words: "The figure of Manzoni's unnamed returns. The globalization of indifference make us all unnamed, nameless, and faceless perpetrators." We note how Manzoni and Benson converge here. In a time of great uncertainty, the interview with Austen Ivory, published on April the 8th, 2020, Pope Francis refers to Manzoni's work. Ivory rightly notes that in the novel several ecclesiastical characters appear. The cowardly priest Don Abbondio, the saintly Cardinal Archbishop Borromeo, the Capuchin friars who do their best in the Lazzaretto, a kind of a field hospital where the infected are kept strictly separated from the healthy. Therefore, he asks the pontiff how he sees the mission of the Church in light of the novel and pandemic crisis. Bergoglio replied, Cardinal Federico is a true hero. Is a true hero of that plague in Milan. In one chapter, however, he says that he passed by greeting the people, but looked into the litter, perhaps from behind the window, to protect himself. The people were not well taken with it, and God's people needed the shepherd to be beside them, not to protect themselves too much. Today, God's people need to have the pastor very close, with the self-sacrifice of those Capuchins who did that. So he criticized Cardinal Federico Borromeo because the distance he kept from the people, greeting them from behind a window. The pontiff had made an indirect mention of this passage from the Betrothed in Rio de Janeiro at World Youth Day in July 2013, without mentioning the Betrothed at all, giving an interview to Gerson Camarotti of the TV channel Regi Globo, as they said. When Francis arrived in Rio, in fact, mistakes were made in the security system and his car got stuck in the middle of the crowd. I don't know if you remember this moment, which was very scary. The Pope commented, "Before leaving, I went to see the Papamobile that was to be brought here. It had so many windows. If you go to see someone who you love so much, friends with a desire to communicate, do you go to visit them inside a glass case?" "No," he replied, "I could not come to see these people who have such a big heart behind a glass case. And in the car, when I go to the streets, I roll down the window so I can put out my hand to say hello." So you see how reading the Betrothed had an impact on his apostolic, not pastoral, attitude to people, because he meditated on what Cardinal Federico did, and he didn't want to do the same thing. So it's clear that Bergoglio has developed various pastoral considerations precisely from frequent reading of the Betrothed. It is actually in Victor Hugo that Francis finds a beautiful figure of the shepherd. In a text accompanying the reissue of the book The Bishop by Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini on the role of the bishop, Bergoglio recently noted that Martini refers to Monsignor Benvenu, Bishop of Digne, a character in Les Misérables. He wrote, Pope Francis wrote, "One should reread those pages of Victor Hugo describing that pastor. I like them very much, and they inspire me." And so Francis quotes Hugo describing Monsignor Benvenu. Among other things, he quotes him extensively when he describes the bishop as a doctor in a field hospital. Surprise, surprise. And I'm going to quote him. So this is Hugo quoted by Bergoglio. And he's talking about Monsignor Benvenu. He bent over he bent over that which groans and that which atones. The universe appeared to him as an immense sickness. He felt everywhere the fever, listened everywhere to the suffering, and without trying to unravel the enigma, tried to soothe the wound. Francis concludes by quoting the phrase, "Love one another." He aspired to nothing more, and in this was all his doctrine. It really sounds like the epitome of the pastor according to Bergoglio. But what for Bergoglio is the relationship between human beings and the events of history? If I had to choose a poet in whom the pontiff finds his vision well unfolded, I would say Virgil. In his message to educational communities on April 23, 2008, then Cardinal Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, had spoken of the fact that humanity has always conceived of life as a journey and human being as a wanderer, homo viator. In the Bible, certainly, and just think of Abraham, but he wrote, in every human history and mythology, the fact is stressed that man is not a quiet, sedentary being, but he is on the way, called, hence the term vocation. And when he does not enter into this dynamic, then he is annihilated as a person or corrupted. More than that, setting out is rooted in an inner restlessness that impels human being to come out of himself, herself. In particular, Bergoglio refers to Aeneas, who, faced with destroyed Troy, overcomes the temptation to stop and rebuild the city, and taking his father on his shoulders, begins to climb the mountain toward a peak that will be the foundation of Rome. This image is indelible in the pontiff's mind. It's kind of an icon. The icon of Aeneas facing Troy, destroyed, who overcomes the temptation to stop and rebuild the city, and he was very kept by the decision of taking his father on his shoulder and go up to the mountains. The following here, after he gave this talk to the educational communities, he gave long interview, a conversation with Sergio Rubin and Francesca Ambrogetti, and he said of the Virgilian hero, "Beware, Christian passion is not quietist or passive. It's the passion of St. Paul, the one that involves carrying history on one's shoulders. It's the archetypal image of Aeneas, who, as Troy burns, laud his father on his shoulder. Et sublato montem genitori petivi, lauds his history on his shoulders and set out in search of the future." End of quotation. These two quotations from the Virgilian poem are an indication that this work gave the future pontiff much food for thought. To stop is tempting. Aeneas takes the risk of living, of going up, and of doing so by carrying his elderly father on his shoulders. One can therefore seek the future only by carrying the past, history, memory on one's shoulder. As pontiff, he has fully taken up this Virgilian echo, revealing how much the Aeneid has affected his imagination. In particular, he did so in the interview given to Austin Ivory during the pandemic, where he repeated that he said what he had said to Rubin and Ambrogetti. It's also noteworthy that Francis, on October 23, 2018, during the presentation of the book I edited, Sharing the Wisdom of Time, on the relationship between the young and elderly, he asked that an icon by the iconographic atelier of Bose Monastery, up in the north of Italy, be projected just behind him. So the icon depicts a young monk carrying an elderly brother on his shoulders. In fact, it's the same image of Aeneas carrying Anchises on his shoulders. The Pope commented then, "You see, a young man who was able to take upon himself the dreams of the elderly and carry them forward, to make them bear fruits." This perhaps will be an inspiration. You cannot carry all the elders on your back, but their dreams can, and this carry them forward. Carry them, that it will be good for you. You see the same images, the same image. But Francis went further, emphasizing the theme of memory. He writes, "I am reminded in a verse from Aeneid that in the context of the feet, he gives the advice not to lower our arms. Prepare for better times, because at that time, this will help us remember the things that have happened now. Take care of yourself for a future to come, and when that future comes, it will do you good to remember what has happened." The Pope is evidently concerned that the post-pandemic time was imagined to be a turning back into the simple oblivion. Forgetting the lived experience is the greatest temptation when one wants to build the future. He writes further, "What comes to mind is another verse of Virgil's, Forsan et hec olim meminisse juvabit. Perhaps one day it will be good to remember this thing too." We need to recover our memory, because memory will come to our aid. We need to remember our roots, our tradition, which is packed full of memories. In the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, the analysis of present history is broader than the pandemic. And he is reminded of Virgil's famous verse evoking the fearful human affairs. He quoted number 34 of Fratelli Tutti. The Pope refers here to the passage in the first book of Aeneid, verse in which Aeneas speaks to Acate and says, "Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortaliam tangunt." That is, history is tears and human suffering moves to mind. One of the many reasons for this suffering today is certainly the Third World War in pieces. In the volume I Ask You in the Name of God, edited by Hernán Reyes Alcalde, an Argentinian journalist, Francis writes, "More than 2,000 years ago, the poet Virgil, Virgil, fashioned this verse, war does not give salvation." One can hardly believe that since then the world has not learned lessons from the barbarity that inhabits conflicts between brothers, compatriots, and countries. War is the clearest sign of inhumanity. That heartfelt cry still resounds. So there is no memory. Where there is no memory, nothing is learned. So you need memory. For saying that, he quoted Virgil again. Bergoglio's reception of Virgil is in the wake of so many literary scholars and persons of culture for whom the reception of a classic is a fruitful relationship between past and present. It is the resumption of the thread that unites present and past experience, is the possibility of regeneration of a text of the past in order to give insight for charting our future. Aeneas is the hero on the way, who feels moved by a sense of a mission. Bergoglio is very sensitive to this figure of the imaginary, which he also finds in contemporary literature. In particular, he quotes in this regard Tolkien, who writes The Future Pontiff when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, takes up in Bilbo and Frodo the image of the man called to walk. And his heroes know and act by walking the drama that is unleashed between good and evil. So Aeneas and the heroes of Tolkien are in the same page for him. Many other things should be said about Bergoglio and literature. For example, here I have only made a quick mention of the importance of Hernández Martín Fierro for the Pontiff. As I just mentioned, around Buenos Aires by Leopoldo Marechal, I have not mentioned Francis' interest in the literature of immigration, as well as it didn't have time for talking about Baudelaire, Hölderlin, Peman, Borges. He quoted Borges just once anyway. But all this would have taken me too far away. I just want to offer at the end of my speech a basic criterion for reading literature through Bergoglio's eyes. At the Pentecost Vigil on May 18, 2013, Francis had quoted Manzoni's novel again. Do not speak much, but speak with all your life. In particular, here he was quoting the chapter of the Betrothed that he loves most, the one about the conversation of the innominato, the unnamed, where he read, life is the comparison of words. Here is the point. Life and words must always be connected. Therefore, the poetic word that Bergoglio loves is the one that has an intimate relationship with life and provides the images, metaphors, and terms to express it. Interviewing the reading of Hernández, Maleg, Dostoevsky, and Manzoni, putting all of them together, we can sense which kind of humanity Bergoglio has in his heart and mind. It starts from the brutality of the social life of the Dostoevskian anti-hero, a man of the underground. He continues to the genuine folk dimension of Renzo and Lucia, and to the gaucho humanity of the characters in Martín Fierro's epic, and he goes from les classes moyennes de la sainteté, the middle class of holiness, to the Aeneas, who is the hero of the vocation. So by constructing a map of Bergoglio's readings, we can better understand his vision as pastor and perhaps even discover the roots of his way of understanding the life and the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Padre Spadaro. I'm even more proud of my choice now that I heard him. And I think this lecture needs to be listened to again and again and again. And we'll have the help now to continue this conversation with the other two guests. Paul Elie, who is a writer, publisher for many years at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and author of 2 books. And he will help us sort of understand a part of literature, of Catholic literature, that the Pope does not mention, at least in these readings that Father Spadaro did, but that he mentioned, I think, 2 of the 4 figures that you investigate in your book in his speech to Congress, to the United Session of Congress. So Paul is here to help us understand the American dimension of Catholic literature and to help us maybe understand what would you suggest to the Pope to read of the American? I think the reading list is open for suggestions, right, Father? And Paul is the perfect person for that. And then we have Antonio Monda. I always say that Antonio has been on this stage probably just a few times less than I have been. And he's a great friend of the Casa. He's a member of our advisory board. But other than that, he's really a constant source of ideas, of initiatives, and he's always available whenever we ask for his help. And tonight he's here in his role as writer. And we normally associate Antonio as a professor of film studies here at New York University, a cultural organization in one person, I would say in two, because Jackie, that is next to him, is definitely responsible for this constant volcano of promotion of Italian cinema, literature, ideas, philosophy. So he's like a one-person institution like this, the Italian Culture Institute, and a few others, all in one person, okay? So we associate him to that kind of activity so much that we tend to forget that his real joy and passion is writing, is being a writer. He's also a journalist. He writes regularly for Repubblica and several other publications. He has a video rubrica every week on Rai News 24, the Central Park West, that's his address. And the work that he's undertaking now is a series of 10 books. It's going to be a decalogue of 10 books on New York. And each of these books talks about a decade in the history of New York. And why have we called it? Because he doesn't have any hesitation to define himself a Catholic, and you don't find many of those around. And also because I think in his books you find some sort of the sense, not that he presents all saints. I would say you like sinners. You're more interested in sinners than in saints. I mean, there is a priest that is the protagonist of one of his books, and the book is called De Indegno, the Unworthy, so you can understand what kind of priest it is. So far from being somebody that presents the rosy picture, but definitely the presence of sin and grace are some of the elements that are central to the work of Antonio as a writer. So I would like to invite Paul Elie and Antonio Monda to join us on the stage, along with Michael. Please, Michael. Paul, you go first. And what would be the suggestion that you give to the Pope for his reading list? The Pope give a lot of suggestions to people about what they should read, and of course suggest an American or two Americans.
That's a good place to begin. Thank you. I'd suggest that Pope Francis could read a recent novel, Crossroads, by Jonathan Franzen. Franzen, who was born in the late 50s or early 60s in Missouri, written half a dozen iterations of what Saul Bellow called the large audience novel. And his second novel, Strong Motion, had to do, in a way, with religion, because it had to do with the politics of abortion in the 1980s. Some years passed, and I hadn't forgotten that book. I invited him to do a conversation at Georgetown at the prompting of Bishop Paul Tsai, who's known to a number of us here. And I wanted to talk about religion, how that figures into fiction for him. And he responded yes right away. I didn't realize at the time that he was writing a book that had to do with religion and the life of an American family in the 1960s and afterward. That book is Crossroads. The protagonist is a Protestant pastor with a family, and in the manner of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, which was originally called The Household of Faith, the effects of religion on each of the characters, the pastor, his wife, their children, and various people they deal with, is something like the emotional heart of the book. Now, Antonio Monda, you've had Franzen as a guest to the Conversazione in Italy. Did that ever come up with you in your conversations with him?
First of all, thank you. I'm a little bit surprised to hear Franz's name. He's a marvelous writer. He's definitely interested in religion and spirituality. I wouldn't associate to Catholicism, though. This does not mean that Bergoglio wouldn't be... I'm sorry?
I didn't realize what Catholic novel he should be reading.
I would give a different suggestion, if I may.
Of course.
A Clockwork Orange. I think Anthony Burgess is a name that is often missed among the Catholic writers. But I think the Clockwork Orange is not only a great novel and eventually also a great film, but is a story focused on free will, and which is ultimately a Catholic idea, a Catholic theme. I think that, I don't know if I can use this as a joke, but Franzen is an elapsed Protestant, and which makes, to me, a very interesting character. He's, again, a marvelous writer, but that book shows close crossroads, a longing for something that he misses. And I think the character of the priest, the Protestant priest, is someone that he criticizes and loves and admires at the same time.
And a question following up on what you're saying, Paul. So let's try to define, because we are not here to talk about exclusively Catholic novels. My question to you was, what would you suggest the Pope puts in his own reading list? And it doesn't have to be a Catholic novel. But let's go to that. What makes a novel Catholic? Can we call it like that? Does it have to be written by a Catholic? Does it have to have Catholic themes in it? What are the ones that we consider such? So it's a question for all of you. Paul and then Padre Antonio.
All right. Well, thank you for asking. Just to connect with Franzen for one more moment, I was listening to Father Spadaro's remarks, of course, with Manzoni in mind, and of the many things that you said, Father Spadaro, the well-known expression of Pope Francis is that reality is greater than the idea came to mind or stuck in mind, because what I took away from your presentation and what answered for me the question of why I was so gratified that Pope Francis is a reader of this kind is that I think it's fair to say that those of us in this room regard art as reality rather than the idea. And so to know that Pope Francis has a deep, sustained encounter with art is to know that he's in a deep and sustained encounter with reality rather than the idea. So to wind this back to your question about the Catholic novel, I think some parts of the culture, microculture of Catholicism are fixed on the idea of what is a Catholic novel. My work over about 20 years has been to focus on the reality of how Catholic experience figures into art rather than to try to determine what a Catholic novel is. And just to give a brief illustration of this that I hope I can connect with Manzoni, my introduction to the subject was Flannery O'Connor, who wrote about what she perceived as the disjunction between the believing artist and the disbelieving society. She wrote for the reader who she assumed considered God dead. For the nearly blind, you draw on large and startling figures. So her conception of herself as a Catholic artist had to do with a sense of the distance between herself and the reading public. Second idea in this connection was that of James Wood. Now he's a New Yorker book critic. At the time he was writing for the New Republic. In his Essays on Literature and Belief, his first book, he followed the English critic Ian Watt in tracing the rise of the novel as causally brought about by the decline of religious belief in the authority of Scripture. Scripture is less important as a text or as a story in his telling, and into that space moves the secular art form par excellence, the novel. Very powerful argument, but if you think about it, it applies to countries in which the Enlightenment was very strong. In England, in France, in Germany to a certain extent. So I read that and I thought to myself, well, what about other cultures? Would that be true in Ireland? What about the United States? And out of that furrowed brow, quizzical response to Wood came my first book, The Life You Say May Be Your Own, which was about American writers who came to religious faith. 3 of them were converts in a society in which was not yet disenchanted in the pre-war 20th century culture, which was thick with religiosity, Catholicism, and a dozen other kinds. So those writers, and let's mention the two that Pope Francis mentioned in Congress, Dorothy Day, she read Dickens not as the novel of a secular culture, but as a novel of what Pope Francis calls social fraternity. That she read Dostoevsky as a witness to a world of belief and not to a world of disbelief. Thomas Merton read people we associate with antagonism towards religion, like William Blake, as voices of a very powerful European spirituality that he tried to recover in America. So all this is just to say, for them, fiction with religious dimension was a encounter with reality as opposed to the idea of religion. And just to remind myself, if not you, why we're here, that has been my experience reading The Betrothed in Michael's fantastic translation, is to have access to the reality of 19th century Italy, looking back on 17th century Italy, and the reality of the way religion figured into that period in a way that I hadn't had access to until I was able to read the book in your translation.
Well, I believe more in the Catholic eye than in the Catholic novel. I mean, I think that is the Catholic attitude to understand things in reality, help us to understand or to consider a novel as a Catholic. So it's your eyes, it's your understanding that helps you to see something Catholic in everything. So for me, Catholicism and faith and God can be seen everywhere. So it's not this is a matter of faith. So if you don't have faith, you cannot see God in all things, as this is a quotation by St. Ignatius Loyola, from the fundador of the Jesuits. So it's your eyes that makes a thing that can discern the presence of God in everything. So also in any kind of novel or piece of art or music even. Of course, there are some elements that are very Catholic in a novel. So the Catholic faith can inspire an author to write things. And one of the best Catholic, my favorite Catholic principle, is what Carlos William said once: no ideas but in things.
No idea?
No ideas but in things. So no ideas but in things. It's a verse. So no ideas if they are not in things, in reality. So you cannot, for writing a Catholic novel, you have to believe in experience. So reality comes first. So before ideas. This is the principle that you just explained, that Pope Francis gave, one of the first principle of his way of thinking. So the principle of the most important thing of the Christian faith is incarnation. So God is here, is in the world. So you have to try. And the Pope said in my interview in 2013 that you can discern only in history or real life, not in ideas. So you cannot discern the ideas. You can discern just life, real life. So ideological novels are not Catholic novels. And there are some Catholic-inspired novels which are very ideological,
but not Catholic.
Which means that they are not Catholic. And
only a Jesuit could lead us in this direction, and we all go like this, right?
so we have to be very careful discerning which is Catholic, which is not. Because sometimes Catholics means ideological, so it's kind of a religious ideology, which is that doesn't produce a real literature at all. And another point I want to underline, I already said that before, is that the Catholic novel is made by tensions. If there isn't tensions, you cannot find anything of Catholic. So in this sense, Flannery O'Connor is huge. I mean, this is the author I want to suggest to Pope Francis to read in his free time. Because there is the tension, strong tension between grace and evil, and for her, you find grace in the territory of the evil. So if you don't find evil, if there isn't evil, grace cannot work at all.
And Father Spadaro, I think that in your own interest in literature, you're not too interested in authors that one would define Catholic, or that are self-defining Catholic. Your first book is on Pier Vittorio Tondelli. For those of you who are not familiar, he's a very important author of the contemporary author. He was the first openly gay author who died of AIDS in Italy, so he was very renowned, very popular, incredibly popular. And in your book, you don't try to turn Tondelli into a Catholic icon, but you're interested in his attesa, in his waiting for. And the same thing you were telling me about Hopper. We were talking at dinner about the exhibit that is now at the Whitney. The last book of Padre Spadaro includes a part on Hopper. And I, ignoramus that I am, I thought, it's about solitude. And you told me, no, it's about l'attesa, waiting for something or somebody. So Hopper too, I mean, it doesn't paint Madonna and child, and it's like, so would you say that also the Pope has the same attitude? He's more interested in people who are an open heart and are waiting for than in people that have already discovered. They've already discovered, fine, they're good.
Yeah, but if you are Catholic, you are open to experience.
Absolutely.
And so, because you know that God works there. So your tension is to understand where He is and how He is working. So the definition of Catholicity means to be open to experience, because God incarnated in the world, and so He chose to be with us, and so He is in the experience. And the novels mirror the experience. So you can find God everywhere if you have the right eyes and if you are available. Waiting, of course, the Catholics, we are living the Advent, this time of the liturgical year, which make us open to the coming of our Savior, which means that we don't possess the Savior, and He is free to come wherever He wants, and whenever He wants.
You kind of anticipated something, a remark I was going to make simply about defining what we mean by Catholic, because growing up they talked about Catholic with a capital C or with a small c, and small c being more universal, and when we talked about the church it had to be with a capital C. But I think of the many things I'm taking away from your talk and about Francis, this emphasis on diversity is very important. And I would explain, because I was very heartened by his election to Pope, because he was non-European, because he was American in the true sense of North American, South American, because he knew, or he would have to know, what the Catholic Church meant in North and South America as opposed to what it meant in Italy or in Europe. In Italy, where there's a kind of, less so today, but there was a kind of ethnic homogeneity, and the Catholic religion was part of that. In here, it's a very different situation. I know that what it meant for my parents, and for a country like the United States, for example, where people are moving from their place of birth. And it's a community center of sorts, and all kinds of people come together with no ethnic commonality whatsoever, and perhaps not even, especially we're seeing today, not even sharing the same beliefs on a kind of spectrum of sorts. So this emphasis on, it sort of helped clarify my thinking on Manzoni and Catholicism, and in sort of being reluctant to approach the topic, also because I too have difficulty with abstract thinking, and it is in the concrete things. And I think one of the failures of the novel for me actually is around the figure of Borromeo, because it's that one moment where he gives this long sermon, way above the heads of any reader or of any character in the novel, that irony disappears completely. And it's all about speech, and it's all about rhetoric, as opposed to actions. And even Borromeo's actions are suspect, not just, the glass carriage, of course, but even going along with this big pageant, of carrying the body of his uncle, through the streets of Milan, which then propagated. And then the things that Manzoni puts in a little hidden footnote about witchcraft and torture and stuff like that. But in that light, in thinking of what would be a Catholic novel, I'm thinking of the messages that I received also growing up from my family, which did become disenchanted from the church. We're now celebrating the 60th anniversary, I believe, of Vatican II, which was a huge moment for educated American Catholics, I would say. The Catholics of my generation, who I call the Kennedy Catholics, were emerging from a period of oppression within the American political system, within American society, to claim their place in America. And the Vatican II was tremendously liberating for them. And for the priests that we knew, many of whom were missionaries and became involved in the social gospel. But one of the messages, they were all difficult, the messages that were received. One was from, the Old Testament, you are your brother's keeper. And of course, having 3 younger brothers made that, a little tough, because we were, constantly fighting. If there is one book that I would recommend, it's something. It's just because it's what I'm reading now, and I can never remember what I read last year. But it's called Brothers and Keepers by John Edgar Wideman, who is talking about the different roads that he and his brother took. He becoming a prominent writer, his brother ending up in jail, being associated with a crime in which murder was committed. Because there is that tension, because there is that struggle, and because there is that impossibility of taking care of his brother, or at least feeling as if he's doing it adequately.
Antonio, a question for you. I said that in your books there are more sinners than saints. Are sinners more interesting to portray than saints? The question is obviously yes, and we think of our Dante Alighieri and how enthralled we are all with Inferno and how problematic the reading of Paradiso is, unless you are somebody who is an expert and who has a certain understanding. Saints and sinners, which ones do you prefer to portray in your books?
Let me start by saying that I don't want to play humble here, but after mentioning Dostoevsky, Flannery O'Connor, you cannot mention my name. It's a little bit ridiculous. But I am serious about it.
You're a writer that writes today.
I'm someone who writes. I don't know if I'm a writer. It's different. And regarding your question, in terms of narrative, evil is always more interesting, always. In terms of religion, Spadaro already responded. Wherever is evil and sin, there is grace. It wouldn't be possible the opposite. But he reminded me an interesting story when he mentioned about being a Catholic or trying to be a Catholic or pretending to be a Catholic, which applies also to politics. How many politicians now are, showing the rosary or quoting the popes, especially the old popes? And I remember a mayor of Rome a few years ago was chasing the Pope everywhere he went, and at the end this Pope was upset and say, I didn't invite him. He defines himself a Catholic, which is one of the cruelest things I ever heard from a Pope. Going back to the story that Father Spadaro mentioned before, in 2004, one of the books that I wrote, one of the early books that I wrote was called Do You Believe? Tu Credi? It was a collection of interviews about religion to 18 major American personalities. The number is strange because there were supposed to be 20, but Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton refused to be interviewed. So I stuck with 18. When I was preparing that book, I was also working on another faith-oriented retrospective called The Hidden God, at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. 50 films where God is the lead and you don't know it. So while I was preparing that, I called a mutual friend, Father Virgilio Fantuzzi, who was the film critic for Civiltà Cattolica, another Jesuit priest. And I asked him for a suggestion. I said, which film would you consider? Tell me a few films where God is the protagonist and you don't know it. And his answer was, all of them, all the films. And can you imagine, as a curator, what do you do? You know, all the films. So I totally agree with Antonio. It's in the eye of the Catholic, the solution and the real angle is not what you want to show or what you pretend to show. And if I can shrink this to me, I try always to deal with themes that, yes, are also the same themes of Dostoevsky, Flannery O'Connor, Graham Greene, nobody mentioned him so far, and many, many others. But, and the themes are sin, guilt, perdition, damnation, redemption, and so forth, and grace, of course. And finally, I want to say I had the great privilege, thanks to Antonio and my brother Andrea, to meet once the Pope. And actually, the Pope was not waiting for me, was waiting for Martin Scorsese, but Scorsese was my guest at the Rome Film Festival, so I was just with him. And I remember that they spoke about Dostoevsky. And they spoke about, what's the title? Notes from the Underground? Memorie del Sottosuolo, and which is for both their favorite Dostoevsky's novel. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is the first inspiration for Taxi Driver, Scorsese's film. So how would you define this? I don't think Scorsese or Paul Schrader, who wrote the script, had in mind to do a Catholic film, but definitely it's ultimately a Catholic story and a Catholic film. I don't know if I answered, but it was...
Yes, yes. A question for Paul. One of the reasons why Manzoni is not so popular in the United States, for example, is definitely one of the pillars of the canon in Italy. In schools, it's taught mandatory reading in all high schools. All Italians read it. And of course here, granted that it's not an American author, but there are other authors like Dante or Machiavelli that are definitely part of the curriculum. They're taught in every university. Even when there is no department of Italian, there is somebody who teaches Dante, Machiavelli. Manzoni is completely absent. Even in departments of Italian studies like this one, that is the big one, there isn't one expert that does 19th century or Manzoni. Is the anti-Catholic prejudice still alive today in America? Is that still a valid explanation for the exclusion of Manzoni, or you think we need to look for other reasons?
Reality is greater than the idea. So anti-Catholic prejudice is an idea. The reality is complex. Dostoevsky had the Bloomsbury Group as his advocates. Dickens wrote in English. Other international writers, the transmission of literature from Europe to here is a super complex topic, and I think the lack of an advocate would be, I suspect, a powerful reason for the lack of Manzoni's presence here. Many in the room will know better than I what it was in the Italian-American experience that led Italian-Americans to wish to leave behind their homeland in a way that wasn't true, let's say, of Irish Americans who celebrated Irish literature from the New World in a way that was not so true of Italian Americans. I'm, as I say, venturing into areas where there are experts in the room. But to me, those explanations are more pertinent than anti-Catholic prejudice. I think the question that Michael and I were mulling over on the phone yesterday is even to what extent how present the Catholic dimension is in the book. My account of it is that the Catholic world is credited. A vow is something that is considered real and not silly, whether it's the vow of marriage or the vow of chastity. self-sacrifice is a legitimate move and not performative. It's not just an inverse, cloaked expression of the will to power, which it is in many subsequent books. The question of Borromeo, which I think you can see him as a person tending towards sanctity or a person tending towards pomposity, or both. In any case, the measure is he a true Christian, which allows us to believe that there is such a thing as a true Christian, and that it's not just there's no God, and so all is lawful, as Ivan Karamazov would have it. So that Catholic dimension of the book is what I'm want to kind of almost ask the three of you who all know the novel better than I do. Is that real? And is it sufficiently real as to prompt anti-Catholic prejudice? I'm not really sure. What do others think?
It was interesting in the first presentation of the book that I did in New York at the Rizzoli bookstore. I was with Andre Asseman, who reads Italian and knows the novel and insisted on reading it in Italian before reading the translation, and was delighted, first of all, to discover how much humor there was in Manzoni that he had forgotten about, or that he had never noticed before. But in our discussion, his objections to the novel concerned conversion, which is something, he just found it improbable. And I said, well, that's because you're Jewish, because conversion, is such a fundamental aspect, certainly of Italian literature, I think, but of the Catholic religion, this belief that anyone could become a Catholic, could convert, even, I call it sliding into home plate, the last minute, that you could repent for your sins. And, my abiding concern as a child, of course, was getting into heaven, and I used to think that the only way would have been if I'd become a child martyr, because I knew that the sins would sort of accumulate. A child martyr was the only way I was going to make it to heaven, because that way we weren't allowed to read violent books, but we read saints' lives, which have pretty violent, But again, I think that the conversion is central to the narrative, and forgiveness. I think the fact that the novel cannot come to a conclusion. Renzo cannot meet Lucia in Lazzaretto until he sincerely forgives Don Rodrigo, despite all of the anger that he feels toward him. So I see those two themes as Catholic, and I don't see them in any kind of opposition to the values, certainly, of American society.
And to go back to Dante, one of the major Dante scholars in this country, we were talking about him before, John Fraccero's book, it's Dante and the Poetic of Conversion. So the conversion is the central experience that marks Dante and marks his literary experience. So definitely it is at the center of Italian culture, because Dante is the main pillar of it.
And in the United States, there's a particular expression for it, born again, for conversion.
Yes, I think there is a prejudice. It's not about people, it's about ideas. I think the gospel, the Catholic faith, is somehow blasphemous for a Protestant country. Bless the last, love your enemy.
But they believe in that too.
I'm sorry?
Protestants believe in that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the idea that success is not important, it's really blasphemous. It's really something that goes against the roots of this country.
I wanted to open the discussion. If there is any question or comment from the audience, we'd be happy to. Yes.
Tochi is a student of mine, so.
Yeah, try not to disappoint you. Father, first of all, it was a beautiful talk. I would like you to thank you for that, and for all of you for the beautiful words of wisdom. But in speaking about what makes Catholic literature and what makes Catholic art, and coming up with your comment about the tensions, it's also to talk about the literature of encounter. And this encounter for me also seems to take place in a different modality of time that is not very much the modality of time of lost and of chronos, if you want, but a time of opportunity, if you want to go to St. Augustine, to Kairos, a time where you can found this grace, something else. But this also seems to me to reverse to the time of reading itself, that the time of reading is also in this modality of encounter, in this modality of difference of Kairos as well. So how all of you see this reflection of the encounter in the narrative, in the literature, and the encounter of the reader and the book?
It's a great question.
Catholic. It's an easy question, of course. But the Catholic faith is a Catholic of encounter. So if you don't meet Christ, you believe in an ideology. So faith is a personal encounter. So it's always a kairos. So the Catholic faith, the Christian faith, is a faith also in time. So we believe in time, which is always a progression. So you can get back, And the Catholic time is linear, so it's go forward. It's always go forward. And going forward, this time which goes forward is the place where you can find God and you can recognize God. So the Catholic reader is a discerning reader. So is a person who is able to recognize, as I told you before, God's in all things. So reading a book, for example, that was true for Augustine, is and for many, reading a book is the opportunity for meeting God, and there is a long tradition of digestive reading, as the Catholics said in the past, and so the act of reading is an act of digesting. So you are never outside of the text. For a Catholic, you are always involved in reading. You are the discerning reader, and the reading involves your spiritual life. So, if I may say, the time of reading is always a time of kairos.
Thank you. Yes. And I think this is going to be our last question.
The author of Schindler's List, I can't remember his name. He's a Irish-Australian author. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Thomas Keneally.
Exactly. He recently wrote a very powerful book on the experience of a Catholic clergyman from Australia who was sort of banished to America because of part of the sexual scandals of the Catholic Church in Australia. I'm wondering if any of you have written that book and have anything to comment about that Catholic novel.
Unfortunately, I haven't.
We're looking at you because you're the only possible.
I'm going to read it, and maybe then I can recommend it to Pope Francis.
Yeah, it's a powerful book. It has its critical elements of Catholicism in it, but it's from the point of view of a dedicated Catholic clergyman. So it's a fascinating book. I recommend it.
What's the title again?
I think it's God's Soldier, something like that. But Keneally is a very famous author, and he's just prolific in his books, and this is his most recent book, I think. Fabulous. It's sort of written in the style of Jonathan Franzen, in the sense that it's very readable and entertaining.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we're going to bring you the microphone, Antonio, in the meantime.
No, I just wanna, if I may, very briefly, may add another title to recommend the Pope. It's
Padre Antonio, then you bring them on the list.
It's called San Manuel Bueno Martyr by Miguel de Unamuno. It's an extraordinary book about a priest who has lost his faith, and however he keeps celebrating the Mass. And the people from the village where he lives don't know about his tragedy and his lack of faith and consider him a saint. It's a wonderful, wonderful.
What's in the title again?
San Manuel Bueno Mártir.
Thank you. Yes.
Several of you have mentioned something about novels that are ideological, and they're dealing with the idea rather than the reality. And I just wonder, could you give an example of a novel that you would consider ideological and therefore might purport to be Catholic but isn't? I'm just having a hard time getting my mind around that.
Thank you.
I can't think of one, but I'm sensitive to the point you raise. When quoting Pope Francis, reality is greater than the idea, that's not to discredit ideas. I would say that just when we look at the Catholic Church historically, the certain ideas have led Catholic clergymen in particular to suppress the reality that's found in art because it didn't suit a particular idea, or because certain ideas about sexuality or marriage or whatever weren't represented in the way that the church found appropriate. So in that sense...
Just for example, what would be an example?
Well, there was a lot of tension over Graham Greene's novel having to do with marriage, wasn't there? The End of the Affair?
The End of the Affair, yes, definitely.
Would that be an ideological novel?
I don't know if it's ideological, but there is definitely a message, you know. He wants to say something. I don't know if we can call this ideological.
Well, he's certainly dealing with the reality of a marriage and the end of the affair. It's not just the idea of a marriage.
That's what I meant to say, that the novel depicts a reality that was at odds with the teaching of the church about matrimony, and so he came in for some heat in the years before he was eventually broadened from the cold after the Second Vatican Council.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to thank you for your participation. You're not many, but as you might know, Manzoni addressed his readers as my 25 lettori, my 25 readers. So I think we're approaching that number, but we do this also because it's video recorded, it was live streamed. Please let people know, especially encourage them to buy their copy of the Betrothed, and finally learning it. And it's a great Christmas present, and you can also suggest to your friends to listen again to this wonderful conversation. Thank you to Padre Spadaro, Antonio Monda, Paul Elie, and of course Michael Moore. Thank you.
Grazie.